Sergeant Daniel Neep of the U.S. Army participated in the Battle of Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876, while serving with Company C of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. He is renowned for his bravery and thorough account of the events that transpired, as well as for his noteworthy efforts during the conflict. One of the few people to survive this intense altercation was Neep. He gave important testimony about the activities of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer in the 7th Cavalry during the ensuing court of inquiry. Neep remained serving in the military after the battle and subsequently produced a biography detailing his time at Little Bighorn. His book, The Neep Story, is considered a crucial historical record for comprehending the conflict. Sergeant Daniel Neep is a well-known character in American military history because of his valor and dedication at the Battle of Little Bighorn. We embarked on what would out to be a regrettable voyage on May 17, 1876. To receive more historical insights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. After trekking 12 miles in the direction of the Yellowstone River, we pitched up camp near the Big Heart River and took some time to look around. We proceeded to the Powder River by approximately June 10th. 6 troops out of the 12 were assigned to a reconnaissance operation. We got off the wagon train at the Powder River, rode pack mules that were laden with 10 days' worth of food, and started the 2-day trek up the river. We discovered the Indian Trail alongside the Rosebud River as we turned toward the Tongue River. We made coffee as darkness fell and spent the night hiking the trail. We made more coffee the following morning and marched till noon. However, our detachment's commander, General Reno, made the decision to go back down the Rosebud River after noticing that our 10-day supplies were running low. We eventually reconnected with the regiment's other 6 companies. General Terry, the department commander, was present when General Custer was arrested. Custer's hostility to the post merchants who had received concessions at various posts that were later reversed amid post-ridership scandals during President Grant's administration is said to have prompted this move. Getting anything at the post office without first getting it from these sellers was practically impossible. The quantities usually contained little amounts of whiskey, and a tumbler of liquor cost 25 cents. On setting a maximum price on these commodities, Custer was arrested. He was given a command at the designated area, nevertheless, and was joined by other top Army leaders. Place: the steamship Far West, which was on the river, delivered enough supplies to Custer's battalion for 15 days on July 22nd. Additionally, Custer had 2 Gatling and 2 Rodman guns, which he gave to General Gibbon, who took them across the river because he thought they could get by without them. In retrospect, this choice is seen as a mistake because if he had kept one of the Rodman guns and fired it even once, the Native Americans would not have stopped their departure. The result probably would have been different. The so-called Custer Massacre might not have happened if there had been a Gatling gun available. We broke up our camp on June 22nd and moved forward all day. That evening, Custer forbade the use of bugle calls, restricted fire to just enough for making coffee, and mandated that instructions be given by hand signals. On the morning of June 23rd, we set out again. We set up camp and resumed our journey the next day, June 24th, after marching until almost dusk. We arrived at a location on this particular day where the Native Americans performed a sun dance in addition to a war dance. Because of their activities, the ground was smooth and hard, and they had built brush houses out of cottonwood trees. A white man's scalp was found during this period by 6 Crow Indian scouts who were with our group. The Native Americans, who harbored hostility for the Sioux we were following, were ecstatic to see the scalp hanging from a willow branch and burst into cheering, dancing, and chanting when a soldier under Gibbon's command reported the incident. They were so determined that it would have been a terrible day for the Sioux if they had been found. The scalp was given to General Custer, who examined it before distributing it to the soldiers. It was kept in the saddle pockets of Sergeant Finley, the senior line sergeant in my company, at the time of his death. We marched all day long on June 24th. Around 10 o'clock that night, the Indian scouts who had been dispatched earlier made their way back. At the time of his death, it was in the saddle pockets of my company's senior line sergeant, Sergeant Finley. On June 24th, we marched all day. The Indian scouts who had been sent out earlier returned at about 10 o'clock that evening. Even though it was dark, there was enough light to read at 9 o'clock thanks to the summer nights. We were told to prepare our horses and pack our equipment that evening. We marched through the night to where the Rosebud River and Little Bighorn meet. The troop was led by General Custer into a ravine that appeared to be the perfect place for us to stay hidden for a long time. However, Quartermaster Sergeant Hurst lost some hard tack from the pack train as we arrived at a fast trot and gallop. When General Custer discovered this, he gave the sergeant instructions to get the bread. Two Indians were assisting themselves to the bread as the sergeant reached the location of the fallen supplies. They immediately ran away as they saw the army arriving. When the sergeant got back to camp, he told General Custer about the incident, and he gave us the order to get our horses ready. At first, I thought he was going to surprise the Indians the next morning, but since they knew we were coming, he decided to act right away. We stopped after advancing up the divide, and General Custer left for 2 hours with 2 scouts and Henry Voss, the chief trumpeter. He split the regiment into 3 detachments upon his return, assigning Major Reno 3 soldiers, designated A, M, and G, Captain McDougal 3 troops, designated H, K, and D, to lead the pack train with Troop B, and Custer 3 troops, designated C, E, I, and F, for his own command. We moved down what is now known as Benton's Creek until we came to a crossing, where we came across an abandoned Indian camp still marked by smoldering fires. After the departure from the location, Major Reno was positioned to General Custer's left, with Captain Benton to his left. It was clear that 3 different approaches would be used to attack the Indian camp, with Captain McDougal leading the pack train along the main Indian trail. When Major Reno arrived, he was told to cross Benton Creek, which he did right away. General Custer ordered the burning of one of the teepees that still held a dead Indian. General Custer led 3 companies down the creek. I saw Indians on the hills above the river as we got closer to the point where Benton's Creek and the Little Bighorn meet, which is about a quarter of a mile away. I quickly let First Sergeant Bobo know that they were there. General Custer looked up at that point, and battalions CI and F started to climb the bluffs where the Indians had been spotted. My troops C were commanded by the general's brother, Tom Custer. By the time we arrived at the crest, the Indians had vanished despite our spirited ride. But the teepees could be seen for miles in all directions. The goal of our Crow Indian scouts was to sneak down and seize some ponies. When a few scouts tried to enter covertly, they were shot at. Chief Scout Mitch Bowie, Curly, a Crow, Bloody Knife Reeve, and a Ree or Urakara were still on the bluffs with us. When the troops from the 4 companies spotted the Indian camp in the valley, they started to cheer and yell, so we rode to the far end of the bluffs to be ready to attack it. I rode near Captain Tom Custer, and Sergeant Finkel rode near me. Finkel yelled at me, saying he was getting close to his breaking point. His equine companion was distressed. I answered the phone. "Please come along, Finkel, if you can." He pulled back a little. The captain then gave me instructions to go back and locate McDougal and the pack train so that we could deliver the directives that General Custer had just given. "Tell McDougal to bring the pack train directly to the elevated ground," he said. "If the packs fall free, don't stop to secure them. Cut them off and move quickly." There was a sizable Indian camp close by. I went back the way I came. I thought this was bad luck at first, but it saved my life in the end. Had Sergeant Finkel not retreated a few seconds sooner, he would have been given the orders and I wouldn't be telling this story. In the distance, I saw the dust, like a tiny cloud, rising from the pack train. I moved in that direction as my group and others moved closer to the Indian camp. I couldn't help but think of General Custer's final remarks. As the soldiers reached the hill, we all cycled at full speed and applauded. Some were unable to control their horses and charged past General Custer. He cried out to the boys, "Hold your horses! We can all find plenty down there." When they had moved on, I turned around. I was instructed to deliver the orders to Captain Benteen as well, so I did so after communicating them to Captain McDougal at the pack train. When McDougal and his men climbed the slope to offer assistance, Major Reno was fleeing from the base of the bluffs. Men were falling everywhere as the Indians behind them yelled and opened fire. The Indians would leap and scalp the fallen before we could help them. Dr. DeWolf was slain as he reached the top of the slope. If he had taken a few more steps, he could have been saved. As I followed Captain Benteen, I saw a number of Native Americans hurrying. I prepared my rifle to fire a few rounds before the enemy could get to me since I expected a hostile encounter. But as it happened, they were scouts escaping the main battle. After leaving Major Reno's command, their dread kept them moving forward until they arrived at the Powder River. I returned to the crest with the battalion after giving Captain Benteen the order, and we reassembled with McDougal and Major Reno. Unfortunately, the Indians were stationed between us and General Custer, so I was unable to join my company. We were forced to withdraw and set up skirmish lines after the Indians attacked after Major Reno went up into the cliffs to engage them. Before we could accomplish this, we suffered losses. Some guys were killed before we could get to them. The Indians opened fire on us during the day, then regrouped at night. Even though I am unable to pinpoint the precise number, we were able to cause them to sustain severe losses as they continued their attack on the morning of the 26th. There were 68 wounded guys in our camp, and we were without water. Hearing the cries of a wounded soldier in desperate need of water was upsetting, but we were unable to help him. A few men were shot while trying to get water, so they were unable to bring any back for the injured. I can still clearly recall the first shot that did not go off throughout the two-day battle. It zipped right under my horse and hit the neighboring ground. 14 soldiers and 2 officers, Lieutenants Harrington and Sturgis, were never located. According to reports, these guys were decapitated and their heads paraded by the Indians during the night while they rejoiced. On the hill, 56 of our soldiers were slain by the Indians. The gunshots continued all day long on the 26th. We noticed that the camp was starting to mobilize by late evening. The warriors kept shooting at us while the women hurriedly packed their things. No Indians were in sight on the morning of the 27th. We made coffee, collected water, and tried our best to help the wounded. Around 10 o'clock, General Terry arrived with General Gibbon and his troops. As we welcomed General Terry, who was clearly moved and crying, our spirits rose. When General Terry later reported seeing 200 troops in the valley below, it became clear that General Custer and his 4 companies had been completely destroyed. It appeared that he might have found himself in a similar situation to ours. I was given permission to go with Captain Benteen to the battlefield later that afternoon, where I was allowed to look around. I recognized a number of people as I looked over the dead, including a sergeant I knew. Sergeants Finkel and Finley were among the dead. The latter was lying at the head of his horse with 12 arrows lodged in his body. The bodies were mangled and covered in blood after 2 days of exposure to the sun. It was obvious which guys had been wounded, since the women and young Indians would often shoot the surviving men with arrows or strike them in the face with tomahawks. They never hurt those who had died, only those who were still alive. No clothes was left on any of the bodies. The Indians had grabbed everything. We had just received our salary at Powder River Camp before to the start of this campaign, so we probably had about $25,000 in cash on hand that they could spend. I could make out the little pile where the last of them had fallen. General Custer lay over a few men, with only the lower portion of his back touching the ground. His heart was pierced, and he was surrounded by the dead. The general's brother, my captain Tom Custer, and his brother-in-law, Lieutenant Calhoun, who commanded H Troop, were close to this last group. Between 12,000 and 15,000 Native Americans were involved in the conflict overall, with about 4,000 of them, not including women, participating. Custer and his soldiers had to contend with a much more powerful force. There were no living witnesses left on the battlefield to recount what had happened after Custer and his 4 companies were routed. Comanche, Captain Keogh's horse, was the only one who survived the slaughter. It had been shot 7 times before it was discovered. Numerous Indians were also found among the dead soldiers. 3 standing teepees contained about 75 Indians, and it is hard to estimate how many more were lost when the Native American camp moved. When I cut one Indian free, I was shocked to discover that he had 4 women's scalps, 2 of which had long red hair tied to a rope as long as my arm. He was dressed in blankets and buffalo robes. Since of the graphic nature of the sight, I immediately threw away the scalps since I didn't want to be connected to such a frightening trophy. Following the combat, we laid our fallen friends to rest before starting the difficult process of transferring the wounded to the steamboat farther to the west. After traveling as far upstream as it could, the steamer was forced to turn back toward the Yellowstone River. The majority of the injured troops made a remarkable recovery from their wounds, and a sizable portion were transported on the steamboat for medical treatment. The elderly Comanche, the only survivor of Custer's disastrous engagement, was one of them. General Headquarters ordered that this horse will live out the rest of his days in a box stall as a memorial to the events of that terrible day. During dress parades, Comanche was carried at the front of the regiment while wearing a black mourning cloth and receiving medical attention from a member of the 7th Cavalry Band. The Indians merely dismantled their tent and resumed their trip after the combat.